Welcome to the OCR webinar, the HIPAA Security Rule Risk Analysis Requirement. My name is Tom Taneem with Kaufman & Associates, and will be assisting with the logistical support for this Zoom session. Questions for today's session have been submitted in advance. If there is additional time today to ask questions, please submit them by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Additionally, we ask that you select the speaker view option located at the top right side of your Zoom interface. This will allow you to see the speaker as they provide information. If you need technical assistance during the session, please type the issue into the chat box and one of our techs will respond to you. Finally, please be aware that today's session is being recorded. The recording and slides will be made available on the OCR website. Closed captioning is available by clicking the CC icon at the bottom of your screen. To enable American Sign Language interpretation, click the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen and select the American Sign Language option. This will open the sign language interpretation video in a new window on your screen. I will now turn it over to Nick Heesters.
Thank you, Tom. So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today to this webinar about the HIPAA Security Rule Risk Analysis Requirement. So I am Nick Heesters, the Senior Advisor for Cybersecurity for the HHS Office for Civil Rights. And before we get started, I'd just like to say that my statements today are intended to be for educational purposes and should not be construed as legal advice, an advisory opinion, or a modification or addendum to the HIPAA rules, OCR's statutory authority, or any published materials by OCR, such as our bulletins, guidance, or notifications. Please visit our website at hhs.gov/OCR for all of OCR's HIPAA-related published materials. All right, so thank you. First, we'll look at what we have as an agenda for today. We're going to talk about the risk analysis requirement, and we're going to talk about what that means, about the regulatory language, what the requirements are for being accurate and thorough, preparing for a risk analysis, methodology, and a sample example methodology for assessing the risks to ePHI, going over some of the common risk analysis deficiencies that OCR sees in some of its enforcement activities and investigations. What you do with your risk analysis when you've done it, when you have your risk analysis results, what do you do next? Go over some resources, and as was already indicated, that there were some questions that were solicited prior to the webinar, and we will be addressing some of those questions. Okay, so first, we're going to talk about the HIPAA Security Rule risk analysis in general. So what that says is that, well, starting from the top here. So the risk analysis is an administrative safeguard. So as part of the HIPAA rules in section 164.308, and the administrative safeguards begins with a covered entity or business associate must, in accordance with section 164.306, do the following: the standards and specifications of the administrative safeguards. Well, the first one of which is the security management process standard, which requires covered entities and their business associates to implement policies and procedures to prevent, detect, contain, and correct security violations. And the first implementation specification underneath the standard is the risk analysis requirement. So this requirement says that entities must conduct an accurate and thorough assessment of the potential risks and vulnerabilities to the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of electronic protected health information held by the covered entity or business associate. So we started off talking about the administrative safeguards section where we reference 164.306. that the standards and specifications have to be done in accordance with that. So we talked a little bit about that on the bottom here to inform some of that information, where 164.306 is what's called the general rules of the security rule. And the first one of these general rules, these general requirements, are for covered entities and business associates to do the following. They must do the following. They must ensure the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of all electronic protected health information the covered entity or business associate creates, receives, maintains, or transmits. Now, there are other things in the general rules that apply throughout the security rule. The general rules also includes the flexibility of approach. So the flexibility of approach has several specifications that talks about ways in which an entity can meet their obligations of the security rule, how they can take into consideration their size and complexity and capabilities. And the reason that that's there is so that the security rule can apply to different types of entities, to different sizes of entities, so that the requirements of the rule, it applies to not only to large organizations, multi-state health systems, insurance plans, but also to solo doctors, rural doctors that maybe come into the office or have their own practice and they come in 2 or 3 times a week. The security rule applies to them. There's nothing optional about the requirements, but there is the notion of flexibility of approach in a way that they implement the requirements of the rule in a way that's reasonable and appropriate for their organization, such that they ensure the protection of the ePHI that they hold. So other things in the general rules include discussions or definitions of what it means to be a standard, what it means to be a required implementation specification, and what it means to be an addressable implementation specification. So all these things are very important things to keep in mind as entities work through their compliance program and understand the scope of the security rule. But today, we're going to talk about the risk analysis. So one of the cornerstones of the risk analysis requirement is that regulated entities, covered entities, and their business associates must conduct an accurate and thorough assessment of the risks and vulnerabilities to their ePHI. So that assessment must be accurate and thorough. It must be correct. It must be comprehensive. It must be detailed. So when I talk to entities about the way to go about doing this, to identify and assess the risks of their organization to ePHI in a way that meets the requirements of the rule, is to consider what the risks to ePHI are in different parts of the organization. And by that, what I mean is that there is a flow to ePHI organization, a workflow. So to consider how ePHI comes into the organization, whether that's through file transfers or uploads into the organization, whether there's some type of manual data entry by employees or maybe even patients into a patient portal to create ePHI, whether there are incoming fax results or other lab results through some kind of API interface into the organization. Where does ePHI come into the organization? And once it's in the organization, where does it go? Where does it go? How is it processed? So does it go into EHR systems? Does it go to clinical labs, radiology departments, other areas of an organization for processing, for viewing other applications and databases? And then consider how ePHI is going to leave the organization. Are there reports that are generated that are distributed to to patients or members, or perhaps to other treating physicians? Do those reports go out by some type of electronic fax mechanism, via email, through some type of file transfer? Are there collaboration tools that are in use, maybe some type of SharePoint system or other collaboration tools? And then disposal, the final disposition. Either whether that's actually disposing, throwing away equipment or media containing ePHI, However, that is repurposing equipment and a need for sanitizing ePHI. So considering the risks to ePHI throughout that life cycle, through the organization, because even though the ePHI may be the same within that life cycle, depending on where it is on that flow in that life cycle, there may be different risks, or perhaps it's the same risk, but there could be a different risk profile, depending how it's accessed or how it's going to be processed or where it is. So those are things that need to be considered in order to make this an accurate and thorough process. So the security rule itself does not prescribe a specific risk analysis methodology, and OCR's guidance is not a one-size-fits-all blueprint for doing a risk analysis, but it does clarify some of the expectations regarding compliance with the risk analysis requirement. Risk analysis methodologies may vary depending on the size of an organization, its complexity, its capabilities, and an organization can use any methodology that they choose, whatever is going to best suit their organization, so long as that is going to result in an accurate and thorough assessment of the risks and vulnerabilities to all of their ePHI. However, there are typically going to be actions and objectives that are common to the risk analysis process. OCR's risk analysis guidance references, as an example, methodology, NIST standard publication, special publication 800-30. So we will use that as a reference for an example for a risk assessment methodology. And the risk analysis itself is a foundational element for achieving HIPAA compliance and protecting ePHI. And that's probably because kind of going back to the flexibility approach, where one of the design elements of the security rule is to be flexible, scalable, and technology neutral. So it is non-prescriptive in nature. And so that allows flexibility for organizations to comply with the security rule, to comply with the standards and specifications in a manner that is reasonable and appropriate to their organization in order to ensure the protection of their ePHI. The risk analysis process is supposed to help inform those decisions. So where there are opportunities for different solutions, different security measures, depending on the level of risk involved, and perhaps the level of risk involved that's different within a life cycle, there may be a solution that is reasonable and appropriate in a particular instance that may be different in a different instance or for a different organization. And we'll talk about some examples of that later on. So this is an example diagram of what we'll talk a little bit about today from special publication 800-30 about the steps in the sample methodology for doing a risk analysis, where we are going to identify threats and vulnerabilities. We're going to look at the likelihood and impact of threats and vulnerabilities, and then we're going to determine what the risk is. So the OCR's risk since OCR's risk analysis guidance came out, 830 has been updated, and there are some different concepts that were introduced in the more current version. There's different levels of risk are discussed as far as organizational risk and mission risk and information system risk, and how that differs from a strategic standpoint and a technical standpoint. So those are all good concepts, but the assessment process, which is the core to this, is largely the same. And that's what we're going to focus on today, is that assessment process. Okay, so one of the first thing we need to do is to look at what the scope of the risk analysis is. So we need to consider the risks to all of the ePHI the organization creates, receives, maintains, or transmits. That's going to be in all forms of electronic media, throughout the flow of the organization. There's going to be computer systems and servers and applications. There's going to be electronic media, optical media, SD cards, flash drives, mobile devices, smartphones, laptops, medical devices. And the definition of electronic media also includes transmission media, so networks. So, how ePHI, electronic protected health information, is going to be exchanged in the organization or external to the organization. Looking at things like how it's transmitted over the internet, internal with Wi-Fi, how that's being used, what if there are specific threats and vulnerabilities in these different implementations. Those are all things that need to be considered. So in the end, that risk analysis needs to take into account all of the regulated entities ePHI, regardless of the particular electronic medium in which it is created, received, maintained, or transmitted, or the source or location of that ePHI. And one of the things that is very helpful, very, very helpful in being able to do this in an accurate and thorough manner is an inventory. An inventory helps you to understand your organization, to understand where ePHI is located, to understand where ePHI goes and how it goes, how it's transmitted. And these are all things that are going to be crucial to being able to create a risk analysis that is accurate and thorough in identifying and assessing those risks to ePHI. So that inventory, a robust inventory that can strengthen the risk analysis process, whereas not having an inventory, a lack of an inventory, or a deficient inventory, that can lead to gaps in the organization's recognition and mitigation of risks to ePHI. Having a complete understanding of one's environment is a key to minimizing gaps and to help ensure that a risk is accurate and thorough. And in this slide, we actually did in the summer of 2020 on our website, there is a cybersecurity newsletter that discusses the importance of how an inventory can really help with the risk analysis process to help it be accurate and thorough as the rule requires. So, and this is something that we'll maybe talk about this a little bit more in the deficiency section, but I think it's worth speaking a little bit about here that. We see this, somewhat often where, when there is an investigation because of a breach or because of something else in a compliance review where, a lack of an inventory, a lack of understanding of the environment either led to or contributed to a breach. I was just on a call recently where we were talking about looking at a case, and there was an attacker had accessed the system, and they had been there for quite some time. They had been on a system, they had exploited a patch on this web application server and had been nesting there for some time, doing some reconnaissance. And in the course of our investigation, we wanted to understand, the organization and how they. What the risk analysis looked like, how they went about doing that to make sure it was accurate and thorough, to see what types of mitigation processes they had in place to mitigate various risks. So, because this was one of the root causes of this issue was the exploitation of some fairly old vulnerabilities, we were interested in understanding how the entity had identified, assessed, mitigated known technical vulnerabilities. And they responded, and we worked with them, and they had internal processes. They had an internal WSUS server to distribute Windows patches and all those kind of things on a regular basis on Patch Tuesday, and that's all well and good. But this breach was on a Unix system, It was on a Unix system in the Apache software for the web server, which had not been updated for years. This was a well-known critical vulnerability that had been hanging out there with no knowledge, no process to even try to go in there to identify that this even existed. So there's definitely a gap there in knowledge of one's environment and knowledge of identifying vulnerabilities to ePHI in these different situations. So this is something that is unfortunately, somewhat common, not understanding one's environment. So the next part we have, next section in the example methodology process from the special publication 830 is about identifying threats. So identifying what the potential threats are to ePHI. A threat being a circumstance or event that has the potential to adversely impact the organization, a potential for a person or a thing to exercise, whether accidentally or intentionally, a specific vulnerability. These can be natural threats. They can be floods, earthquakes, tornadoes, landslides, human threats. And these can be intentional or malicious acts, cyber attacks, environmental hazards, power failures, pollution, chemicals, whatnot. And these are some of the examples that the special publication talks about with some of the threat events that they include for sampling in their appendices in 830. So we can see some examples here. There are some threat events that are characterized as reconnaissance by threat actors, whether that's perimeter network reconnaissance scanning, network sniffing of networks, gathering information using open sources, phishing attacks, crafting phishing attacks, crafting specialized spear phishing attacks, all different examples of threat events that folks can consider as threats to their ePHI within their organization. Certainly, these are not meant to be exhaustive. There may be other threats that folks may have that are particular to their organization that should be considered. And once we've identified those threats, identifying vulnerabilities is important. So identifying weaknesses in information systems, or whether they're system security procedures or a system design, or if they are internal controls, technical vulnerabilities, which could be misconfigurations, unpatched bugs or flaws in a system or an application, non-technical vulnerabilities, could be non-existent or ineffective, unenforced policies or procedures. These are all things that should be considered as part of the overall process in understanding the vulnerabilities to ePHI within your system, within your environment. And we talked about the risk analysis a little bit. We talked about it several times in some of our cybersecurity newsletters, and in our Defending Against Cyber Attacks one, we talked about, again, the importance of identifying technical vulnerabilities. And we identified some examples, so some options for, ways an organization could go about doing that. We talked about subscribing to the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, that is CISA. They have different alerts and bulletins about vulnerabilities. Subscribing to the HHS, Health Sector Cybersecurity Coordination Center, the HC3, for their threat briefings and the different alerts they have about threats and issues in the healthcare sector. Participating in an information sharing and analysis center, an ISAC, or an information sharing and analysis organization, an ISAL, or having a vulnerability management program. So actually doing vulnerability scanning. So using that to be able to detect technical vulnerabilities in your environment, obsolete software, missing patches, periodically conducting penetration tests to identify weaknesses, things like that that could be exploited by an attacker. Those can be additional ways to help to identify those vulnerabilities in your system. And another, once we have identified threats and vulnerabilities, one of the things that we would want to do is to understand how we are currently trying to reduce our risk in these areas. So assessing the effectiveness of any security measures that have currently been implemented. So analyze those measures that have been implemented in an attempt to minimize or eliminate the likelihood or probability of a threat exercising a vulnerability. So many system vulnerabilities are associated with security measures that either have not been applied, either intentionally or unintentionally. An example, could be the Apache web server with those critical vulnerabilities that were several years old, I just mentioned, or they have been applied, but they retain some weaknesses. There could be some residual weakness in security measures that are applied that may need some additional risk reduction measures to ensure that those risks are reduced to an appropriate level. So organizations should consider the effectiveness to reduce vulnerabilities in the face of environmental operational changes, and these could be new technologies, it could be new threats that have emerged, different phishing campaigns, making workforce members aware of things that may be currently out in the wild. We're coming up the holiday season, and holiday season seems to have more of a proliferation of a missing package, or a click here to get your package, we can't deliver it, or other things that could be more associated with the holidays. And aside from that, there's also a tendency over time for security measures in general that are in place that they may degrade in effectiveness. So that's a reinforcement that entities need to maintain their risk assessments, make sure they're up to date, and also to monitor their programs for overall situational awareness of the organization's security posture. And that maintenance, part of that is also another part of the general rules, part of the 164.306. There is also a maintenance provision as part of that that applies to the security rule that says that regulated entities, that they must review and modify the security measures that they have implemented in order to ensure the continued provision of reasonable and appropriate security of ePHI, and to update any security measures that are not appropriate to protecting ePHI. And another thing to keep in mind as far as ensuring that whatever is in place is going to effectively ensure the protective ePHI. So once we have our threats and our vulnerabilities identified, we want to determine what is the likelihood of something's going to happen, the likelihood of an occurrence, and what is the potential impact going to be. I need to assess what the likelihood of that occurrence is based on an analysis of the probability that a given threat is capable of exploiting a given vulnerability, and to assess the magnitude of the adverse impact or harm that may result from the threat triggering or exploiting a given vulnerability. And this is typically a three-step process if we're going to follow the SP 830 methodology, whereby we assess the likelihood that threat events will be initiated for adversarial events, or that if they may occur for non-adversarial, assess the likelihood that threat events that once they're initiated, that there will be an adverse impact or harm, and then assessing the overall likelihood as a combination of likelihood and occurrence, and the likelihood of resulting of adverse impact. So just want to, for awareness' sake, that we are reviewing the SP 830 methodology, but that is not the required methodology. Any methodology that's appropriate to an organization is fine under the security rule, so long as the result is an accurate and thorough assessment of the risks and vulnerabilities to the ePHI. Next, we're going after, okay, so here's an example. So this is an example of some of the ways to describe, to assess likelihood and impact. So these are again from SP 130, and we're going through some of these at a fairly high level just because of the format of the nature of the webinar. But if folks haven't had an opportunity to look at SP 830 and look at it in conjunction with OCR's risk analysis guidance, to get a deeper understanding of how those documents can work together, I'd encourage folks to do that. But this is an example from the document for what some of those likelihoods and impact statements might look like. Whether we're using qualitative values or semi-qualitative values, whatever is going to be most appropriate to the organization in their determination of likelihood is going to be fine. And then we want to look at what the impact of the assessment is going to look like, what the adverse impacts will look like, and the overall likelihood. So we have here in the first chart what it's going to look like if there is going to be an adverse impact from almost certain to happen to highly unlikely to happen, and then a combination table of these likelihoods of occurrences and impacts, where we have on the bottom chart we have the first column of the likelihood that the threat's going to occur, and then going across the top columns, the likelihood that if those threats did occur, the likelihood that that result would be an adverse impact. With this information, we can look at determining risk, where risk is a function of the likelihood of a threat event's occurrence and the potential adverse impact should that event occur. And that level of risk could be determined by analyzing the values that have been assigned by the organization to likelihood of threat occurrences that result in impact, and that risk level might be performed by assigning a risk level that's based on the average of the assigned likelihood and the determined impact levels. And that might look something like this, where we have the likelihood scale on the left, the level of impact going across from the top there on the top chart to determine a level of risk, where on the bottom chart we have a definition of what those risk levels mean. And we go from very low, that there is a negligible adverse impact in the organization, to very high, that the threat event is going to have multiple severe or catastrophic adverse effects on the organization. And once we have all this information, we want to document it and update it. We want to ensure that the risk analysis processes are documented in a manner to demonstrate accuracy and thoroughness. We want to periodically review and update as needed in response to environmental or operational changes that affect the security of ePHI. And the security rule doesn't specify a frequency. There's not a defined periodicity within the rule itself, but the OCR's guidance does talk about the benefits of a truly integrated risk analysis, a risk analysis that is integrated with business functions, business operations, how that can be performed as business operations are planned, as new technologies introduced, so that it becomes more of a living process. And an example that could be if a regulated entity is experiencing a security incident, or if they're going to undergo a merger with another organization, if there's turnover in key staff, or if again going to implement new technology. Look at AI being a new technology. So whatever the risk becomes from these changes of the organization, the mergers, key staff leaving, new technologies, that risk of those operational environmental changes should be analyzed to ensure that ePHI remains appropriately protected. So next, we're going to talk about some of the risk analysis deficiencies that OCR has seen over the past few years for risk analysis. But before I get there, there's maybe a couple of things I wanted to back up and just kind of mention. So, one thing about the scoping and the identification of risks within the organization. So, one thing is that the risk analysis doesn't necessarily have to be all done at as one single monolithic task. If there are opportunities to break that up, maybe to have some physical components of the risk analysis done. Maybe there's a team that specializes in physical security, and if it's an organization, maybe a hospital system has a few dozen remote clinics throughout some territory. Maybe that could happen to some fashion to examine risks in those areas, to examine risks to not only to the physical nature of the facilities themselves, but also of the technology within the organizations, whether that be workstations or medical devices, or how things are oriented, how things flow within those satellite offices. And then there could also be, risk analysis that's more specific, more targeted to some of the more technical aspects, maybe perhaps more campus oriented, more data center oriented. And it's okay to look at it like that. Look at the risk analysis being done and in a fashion that's being done by where the appropriate subject matter experts are assigned those specific areas. But in the end, whatever risk analysis scopes or parts that are done, those together are going to need to be representative of the entire organization. So, in order of being accurate and thorough. So just one risk analysis of the data center and nothing else will not, be accurate and thorough, because we're not capturing risks to satellite offices. If we're only going to do office clinics, and we're not going to, look at our mobile devices and applications and things like that, then that's not going to be enough. So, but we don't need to have a monolithic operation all at once. We could, have these done with appropriate SMEs and our specialties, and just so long as the end result of the risk analysis process is a risk analysis that is accurate and thorough with respect to identifying, assessing risks to ePHI throughout the organization. So these are some examples of some deficiencies that we have come across over the past couple of years. So there's a few issues with the top one. So the top one talks about the risk analysis was conducted to meet the requirements for meaningful use. Well, there are some problems with that, potentially problems. Meaningful use, it's part of MIPS now, the incentive program for Medicare, Medicaid, for CMS. So, so that process, that MIPS meaningful use risk analysis is narrowly tailored. So that is not necessarily going to encompass risks to ePHI throughout the organization. So if a risk analysis is being done for primarily for meaningful use, organizations just need to understand that the HIPAA security rule requirement is much broader than what the MIPS requires, and that needs to be done to ensure compliance with HIPAA. All right, so that's the first issue there. All right, so this risk analysis used the results of a prior PCI DSS assessment. Okay, well, that's okay. What's prior? It's prior last month. It's prior 5 years ago. So there is an issue here with is our risk assessment going to be accurate and thorough? Depending on when this assessment was done, and we're talking about a PSI DSS assessment, which most likely is not going to consider risks to all of your ePHI, because PSI DSS is concerned with risks to financial information, to credit card numbers. So I would venture to guess that it's probably not going to be all-encompassing to include ePHI throughout the organization. Again, this will be a fairly narrow assessment. And then finally, in our methodology definition here, we have that assessments of security measures to determine effectiveness and adequacy was out of scope. It's out of scope and not done. So to the extent that security measures are in place, to the extent that those reduce the risk to ePHI, and how that reduction in risk is captured and understood and documented for the risk analysis process, to the extent that that's not done, we're not going to have an accurate and thorough risk analysis. So all kinds of issues that need to be addressed in this one. All right, so our second example, the scope included 75 systems comprised of some number of web servers and some number of computer systems. Well, we're already missing a few things here. I think people could probably recognize. There's presumably, this is there's going to be other things in the organization than web servers, computer systems. To comply with HIPAA security rule, you're going to have to back up your data. There's going to be backup media. Presumably, there will be mobile devices that are used by workforce members, laptops, smartphones, things like that. So those are some things that are, right off the bat seem to be missing from this. 75 systems, a smaller, medium-sized organization, that seems like it might be, a reasonable, number. But this organization is not a small or medium-sized organization. It is a very large organization, a very, very large organization. 75 systems does not constitute an accurate and thorough risk analysis for this organization by any means. Not to mention the missing components, infrastructure systems that are going to support the availability of ePHI. We already mentioned mobile devices, things like that. Our last one on here to talk about is kind of an interesting one. Kind of gets into having a HIPAA security rule compliance gap analysis versus a HIPAA security rule risk analysis. And some of this could be dependent on what the organization asks for. So whether they actually ask for a risk analysis or if they ask for a determination of compliance with the security rule. So in this example, the organization asked for a HIPAA, gap analysis, and when there was whatever incident that led to investigation, when OCR wanted to see its risk analysis, that's what they gave us, and perhaps helpful to the investigation. You can see that the first thing I was talking about, has for the risk analysis requirement, 164.308A1. When that II has a risk analysis been completed? The answer is no. The entity has not completed a risk analysis. So a little meta there of the risk analysis that's provided is saying that there was no risk analysis. Some other ones you can take a quick look at. The one there on the left. Are there any risk analysis that have been done? Yes, no, inconclusive. Information from third parties. What are planned mitigation controls? Having an inconclusive answer does not lend oneself to being accurate and thorough. So there's not much detail, comprehensiveness of risks in this risk assessment. And the risk analysis that was provided is, obviously more than what's on your screens, but that's representative of, what was received in this exercise. So some issues there with environment understanding, identifying the ePHI in a manner that's accurate and thorough in our organization. The one on the right, similar concerns. We have risk identified. Data could be corrupted by hackers exploiting the database weaknesses. What database weaknesses? What databases? What data? We're looking about ensuring that the firewall is working. What does ensuring the firewall working mean? Does that mean we're talking about ensuring that proper firewall rules are in place? Do the proper firewall rules, do they reduce this risk? Are we looking at the end of life of the firewall device? Are we looking at the firewall is powered on? So there's a lot of information that's absent here to have an understanding of the organization environment, how this affects to identify and assess and ultimately mitigate the risk to ePHI. Disclosure due to unauthorized account access, ensuring that there are unique accounts for access to ePHI. Strong passwords must be enforced, must be current. Installations of unauthorized applications are disallowed. All good things, but lacking in comprehensiveness in the environment. In June, OCR put out a cybersecurity newsletter regarding authentication. So a lot of things about authentication, about the importance of understanding the touch points of authentication throughout the organization, to understanding those touch points with respect to your risk analysis and the risks those touch points present to ePHI. The fact that the risk profiles of various touch points could present different risks to ePHI, whether it's a customer service rep sitting at their desk in the physical office location, whether it is an IT support person that is elevating privileges that will be able to bypass access controls to ePHI, whether it's remote access, whether it's to authenticate to SAN or virtual management, or maybe a container tool management system that is supporting, containing ePHI. So all of these things need to be considered, and this does not, in an accurate and thorough manner, do that. Our last example is somewhat similar to what we had before on the previous slide. So we have our question here. We begin, is the risk analysis process used to ensure security measures are in place? Is the risk analysis documented? And we can see on the far right-hand side there that we're not assessing risks, we're assessing compliance. What is our compliance with security rule measures, not what is the risk to ePHI? And unfortunately, in this example, the percent compliance is 0. So again, a situation where the provided risk analysis is saying that there is no risk analysis. Another thing that we've just to maybe touch on a couple other ones that we've seen. Just more generally. So the requirement is to do the risk analysis to conduct it in an accurate and thorough manner. So when OCR is reviewing the risk analysis documentation, we are looking to determine if the risk analysis has been done in an accurate and thorough manner with respect to all the organization's ePHI. If the risk analysis doesn't do that, we're most likely going to go back. We're going to ask for more. We're going to say that this does not demonstrate that the risk analysis was done to accurately and thoroughly assess the risks to ePHI throughout the organization. And we see this in different ways. There could be a risk analysis where we're presented with an executive summary instead of a risk analysis, a full risk analysis. We're presented with a PowerPoint document for your board of directors instead of a risk analysis document for ePHI. And one of the things that I think we've seen a few times are heat maps. So heat maps for a risk analysis. I was just looking at one recently where it was a fairly decent sized organization, and we asked for a risk analysis, and the risk analysis we got back was 4 pages long. 4 pages long for a fairly large organization. And the first page was a title page that said HIPAA Security Rule Risk Analysis. So the second page went over some of the things that we talked about from SP 830 about defining likelihood and defining impact. And then the third page was a heat map, which is great. I mean, heat maps are great for presenting awareness of issues to executive management, to showing where they may need to focus resources. But it does not show OCR that what went into the heat map was an accurate and thorough risk analysis. Oh, and the fourth page basically defined the little bubbles on the heat map. So there could have been a bubble that said labor unrest, a bubble that said vulnerabilities in computer systems, a bubble that said misuse of computer systems. So there is no conveyance of accuracy and thoroughness in those broad aggregate bubbles. Now, perhaps that work was done. Perhaps it was an accurate thorough risk analysis, and it's only that the presentation, the heat map, is not demonstrating the OCR that that's the process that was went through. So in those instances, I would encourage folks to provide that information, to provide that documentation that shows that whatever roll up, whatever aggregation that goes into an executive summary to management or whatever, that background work product that represents that aggregation, that's included in what's shown to OCR, so that the organization can demonstrate that what went into that executive summary, what went into that heat map, what went into all those, that aggregation, was in fact an accurate and thorough assessment of risks and vulnerabilities, potential risks and vulnerabilities to all of the organization's ePHI. And I just wanted to spend maybe just briefly a minute about the security risk assessment tool. HHS has that tool. OCR collaborates with ONC on that tool. So I usually participate with ONC and the vendor every September when we do updates to the tool. And we're really trying to ensure that there are opportunities within the tool to ensure that there are places for organizations to include information to convey that the data in the tool represents accuracy and thoroughness. We include more and more free text boxes to include that information. We include the ability to attach external documents to associate those with the tool. So if there are risks that are not identified by the tool, that the tool can be supplemented. And I just wanted to just briefly, read just a couple sentences from the tool's user guide. When I do the webinars, I always advocate that the user guide be read and that the tool be used in conjunction with OCR's risk analysis guidance. So from the user guide, the questions presented by the SRA tool are designed to help organizations identify risks to ePHI common to small and medium-sized regulated entities. Risks that are known to a regulated entity but not identified by the SRA tool should nonetheless be identified, assessed, and documented to ensure the risk assessment is accurate and thorough for your organization. Additionally, if responses to questions in the tool represent risks in the aggregate, organizations should ensure that tool responses include sufficient detail or that supplemental documentation is maintained supporting aggregate risk determinations. Further, as a point-in-time questionnaire-based tool, risks specific to certain technologies or of specific technical vulnerabilities may not be identified by the tool. So again, an opportunity to use those free text boxes to attach supplemental documentation where the tool is not able to identify those specific areas. So that's necessary to ensure that that what is identified and assessed is going to be accurate and thorough for your organization. So what do you do for risk analysis? Well, the risk analysis should be a direct input to risk management processes to assist in developing corrective actions to mitigate risk areas. The risk analysis should guide the implementation decisions of security measures to ensure they are sufficient to reduce risks to the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of ePHI. This has gone through quite a bit in the authentication newsletter. So you can think of authentication being perhaps an example security measure where the risk analysis process can guide the appropriate implementation of a solution for different risk profiles, different solutions of ePHI for the organization. All right, so we have some resources. Before I go over the resources, I just wanted to maybe touch base on some questions. We did solicit questions ahead of time, and I did want to get to these, but before the end of the webinar. So let's try and run through these quickly. So question number one, is a penetration test a requirement of the risk analysis? The answer is no. The risk analysis does not require a penetration test. However, the risk analysis does require that it be an accurate and thorough assessment of the potential risks and vulnerabilities to the organization's ePHI. We already talked about earlier in the presentation how different ways that technical vulnerabilities could be identified, whether that's being alerted to CVEs, whether that is doing using vulnerability scanners, and there are free vulnerability scanners available that can help organizations to do that identification. And penetration tests could be a part of that repertoire to assist organizations, but it is not strictly a requirement of the rule. So we talk about another question, although it's not necessarily the most frequent type of breach in healthcare, attacks on plastic surgeons are increasing with devastating effects. Storing sensitive patient photos seems like a needless and avoidable risk. Surgeons continue to do it. Can OCR address to make it clear that surgeons who do this could be liable to enforcement action by OCR? Okay, well, that's very true. To the extent that a plastic surgeon practice is a covered entity, that they are a healthcare provider that transmits electronic health information in conjunction with the transaction, covered transaction set, then they are going to be an entity that's covered under HIPAA, and they are required to comply with HIPAA rules in their entirety, the privacy, security, and breach notification rules. If there are breaches, if there are complaints from users, or patients rather, OCR can do investigations, can do compliance reviews, and there could be enforcement actions that could involve resolution agreements and corrective action plans and monetary settlements or the imposition of civil money penalties. So they are definitely liable for those negligent actions or inactions. Is there a way for OCR to stress the importance of an annual security risk analysis for all regulated entities? I argue with clients that if they're not doing it annually, that they're unaware of vulnerabilities in their environments, especially ever-changing environments and networks. So again, we talked about a little bit that before. There is not an established periodicity, required periodicity within the rule itself, but we do talk about in the guidance, the importance of understanding your environment. If possible, to look at being that part of the business process to get a handle on your environment, to identify those risks as they come on board, to ensure the protection of ePHI. And then finally, wondering about recommending implementing ISO 27001. Well, OCR, we enforce the security rule. We don't enforce ISO 27001, but the OCR, or rather the security rule, does have as a design principle that it is flexible, scalable, technology neutral, and in that respect, it is not very prescriptive. So to the extent that other frameworks may be in use, a lot of frameworks work well with the security rule, because of that non-prescriptive nature. So where there is a framework, whether it be ISO 27001 or 853 or something else that perhaps is more prescriptive in nature, those can fulfill certain requirements of the security rule. Security rule has a baseline of cybersecurity requirements that should be common to most frameworks. Things like authentication and risk management, risk analysis, backups, disaster recovery, audit logging, audit review, incident response. So all these things are fairly common in most frameworks. So to the extent that an organization is following a particular framework, there are certainly opportunities where implementation requirements for one framework could satisfy security rule requirements. But again, OCR does not enforce those other frameworks. We don't enforce, 27001 and 53, but to the extent that implementation of those frameworks can help to fulfill security rule obligations, we certainly look at those as part of investigation processes. Okay, so I see that we've run over time a little bit. I had some of these newsletter topics up here for folks for our cybersecurity newsletters, our listserv to receive those newsletters. Most recent ones about sanction policies. I mentioned one about authentication, security incident procedures was another one. Defending against cyber attacks. We just did a video on that the other day. Other resources are risk analysis, guidance resource, gap analysis versus risk analysis, NIST risk analysis publications, the risk assessment tool, the HIPAA or health industry cybersecurity practices information that section 405D does. This cybersecurity framework, the healthcare, public health sector, the HSCC, they have an implementation document for implementing the NIST cybersecurity framework. So those are all really good resources out there that can help organizations, with their overall compliance program and protecting ePHI. So I thank everyone that's stayed with me through here. We are over, so I'm going to end it here and wish everyone to continue to hopefully have a good afternoon. And I will just end with our contact slide for folks to keep in touch with OCR, either through our listservs, our website, or on X, formerly known as Twitter. Thank you.